So hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of our discussion. We have learned from a semester of virtual or hybrid that we need to take breaks. So, 30 minutes, 40 minutes of watching some folks have a really good and engaging conversation about the hate you give. As good as it is, you still need to get up, get some coffee, and go to the bathroom. So we hope that you've had that chance, and we're going to dive right back into the text and having conversations with each other. So we know that realities are not, as Kate said, are not just kind of constructed on their own. They're constructed with our environment and the people that we engage with. So we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to talk to each other to kind of dig in deeper to some of the things that some of the faculty have talked about, or some other questions that we have on our minds about the text. So who wants to pose a question?
Well, I have a question for our sociologist, for Kate. So I really found the way you talked about how sociologists approach the idea of the individual as something embedded in the social structures, and how we can't talk about the individual without talking about these structures and the choices they face. And specifically, you talked about the choice facing people of certain people of color to say join a gang or not join a gang, or to deal drugs or not deal drugs. And so, being kind of devil's advocate here, I would want to ask, what would sociologists, or what would you as a sociologist have to say about the place of personal responsibility in that picture? We might worry in the sort of picture you've laid out that people are no longer really responsible for any of their decisions, in the sense that, we're responsible for the things we could choose to do or not do, where we have a real choice. Does that all go away? Are you giving us a picture where individuals are just at the will of these social forces impinging on them, and we're forced to do everything? So we're not really responsible. We're just being carried along by these social forces. Well, yeah, what would you guys say to that? Or you say to that, sorry.
Yeah, Mike, that's a great question. And I feel like I'm transported back into my Social 101 classrooms as you mentioned this, because this is the question that comes up, I would say, usually typically during the first week of class, when I talk about the idea of the sociological imagination, and this idea that especially in American society, we have such a focus on the individual and individual responsibility, and everything is about it being someone's own personal trouble. And the sociological imagination says, hey, let's step back and look at this broader social structure and think about, is this a societal issue? I don't have a perfect answer to your question. I have great discussions about this with my class. And I would say here that I think you would get different answers depending on which of my colleagues you talk to, or which sociologist you talk to. But you're really talking about this struggle between, is it about the structure, right? Or is it about personal agency? And I always tell my students that when they ask this question, that I think about people making choices that are embedded in their social circumstances. And yes, someone can make a choice that I don't agree with, right? Or that violates the law. But if we're to actually understand that choice, we have to think about the broader social structure. And for sociologists, solutions to social problems come at the societal level. Just one individual doing something, right, doesn't, we can lead people have led social movements, but if we want real change to happen, which I think is what this book is calling on us to do, we have to think about, what can our institutions do, what can our social movements do to make change, because our lens in sociology is not on the individual. My very wise colleague, Joanna Gregson, always gives this great example when she talks about sociology, that a lot of people don't know the difference between sociology and psychology. And if we think about it as trees in a forest, the sociologist looks at the whole forest, right? All of the trees all together and how they interact and what that is. Whereas a psychologist might look more at an individual And sociologists are always looking at that group and how they interact together. So I don't think, maybe I'm not answering your question perfectly.
No, this is great.
I don't think our focus is on, as a discipline, on what one individual's responsibility is, right? Our focus is on that larger perspective, looking at all these individuals within this bigger society and thinking about what kind of change we could make as a society, instead of you're one person who's made a poor choice, let's just focus on you. We look at those larger, broader ties. And really, I mean, in any intro to social class, right? This is the conversation that happens throughout an entire semester. So I know my 2-minute answer doesn't give it justice, but hopefully it gives you a little insight into how we might think about it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Kate.
Something you said, Marnie, about media and the consumption of Black pain. And just recently, videos, the most recent video that has been circulating is of Jacob Blake in Kenosha and the killing of his the attempted killing of his Black body. And our obsession with sharing that multiple times on social media, choose a platform for folks to see, and the need for folks to see pain and the murder of Black bodies in order to kind of believe it. And just what is that about? Why is there such a need for Black pain to always be on display?
So I will answer, but I really want to hear everyone else's answers as well, from their disciplines. I mean, personally, in studying media studies, the field looks at how the consumption of Black suffering and Black pain is an historical practice around which people have civically engaged. And so, in really violent, brutal ways like lynching, right, where it became a media spectacle, right, for white pleasure, to, socially just causes like the open casket of Emmett Till, right, where that was a deliberate choice, right, to have it be mediated publicly, so that people could bear witness to it. And so when we think about practices of bearing witness, right, to Black suffering and Black pain, there's almost this sort of principle that we get in media studies where, to see something is to believe it, and it concretizes it for us. But we see that's not true, even when there is video evidence, right? Like police are still not held accountable. And it can also have the effect, right, of making Black pain a commodity, literally a commodity that circulates. And so thinking about all the various ways that it becomes a way to civically engage, I think is important, and thinking about the different contexts for it.
Yeah, Marnie, I think that's such a fascinating question and a very difficult question. And as a philosopher, it makes me think a bit about, in aesthetics, Immanuel Kant, a big, very important modern philosopher, his idea of what he called aesthetic distance. So he had the idea that when we appreciate something aesthetically, we do it from a distance. He calls it a position of disinterest, right? So instead of considering the object and its effect on me or its effect on others, I just consider it purely as a spectacle. One idea could be, think about you're watching someone's house burn down, or even your own house burn down. But from a position of aesthetic distance, you could be like, wow, it's kind of beautiful, right? You could admire, in a way, the spectacle of the flames, right? That's what it is to appreciate something from an aesthetic distance. And in that way, it might seem like a kind of a monstrous attitude, right? Like there's something that feels terribly cold and immoral about to view anything in that respect. And I think the question that you're talking about, both of you are bringing up about this question of the consumption of Black pain, brings that to mind, right? I mean, in some ways, what people intend rhetorically is for it to do the opposite, right? It doesn't distance us, it brings us right into that experience. And then therefore activates us or mobilizes us to do something. But especially as you were just mentioning, Marnie, the fact that it doesn't always mobilize, that sometimes it just keeps things entrenched, but just now has this commodity circulating that, we don't necessarily say, oh, wow, that's beautiful, but we go to it for some kind of, it's terrible to say it, some kind of entertainment or some kind of titillation, or to kind of indulge in it, or even indulge feelings of outrage in it, that in a weird way we might enjoy that outrage, and yet not enough for it to push us to action or for new policies to emerge or be revised. That's a worry I've had too, and I think about it from that idea of consesthetic distance. I worry that we're being distanced, we're doing it in a distanced way when we watch these things. That's not moving us to a moral choice.
Yeah, thinking about what you just mentioned here, Mike, and Marnie, it's making me think about just how focused we as a society in general are on watching crime and victimization, right? And how this is just part of this broader focus on consuming people being victimized, right? You can turn on the television at any point in time, and this has almost become just part of our normal, everyday American media consumption. So I don't know exactly what that means in particular for Marnie's question, but I see it embedded just in this larger focus on us always wanting to see true crime shows, right? And all of this kind of media. And I am concerned, right, that people are going to wonder, like, what is real and what is not real, if this is what we're just always watching in the media, and aren't able to take it seriously enough.
I mean, I just wonder why people don't believe Black people, with their experiences, no matter how it's given an account, right? And the book, has the advantage of being a first person account. And so you're set up to believe, right, Star's experience, which dispels all sorts of narratives of white innocence, right, and cop innocence. So, yeah, why aren't people believed, right? I
mean, that gets back to, right, our larger social structure and who has power and who's able to dominate our narrative, and who gets to define what is true and what is reality.
Well, maybe I have a question here for Marnie that might help us think about this a little more deeply. And we're talking about kind of social structures and kind of how media fits into those social structures. And what we like and hope to see from certain works of media and works of art are works that can come in and disrupt that, shake it up, and maybe see some instigate some kind of positive change. And so I'm curious about The Hate U Give as a particular form of media, and specifically as a young adult novel, as a YA novel. I'm curious from with your communications lens, Marnie, how do you see this book having a role as a young adult novel in, maybe shaking things up or disrupting our standard narratives? Is it an asset, for it to be called a YA novel and be seen as shooting for this particular audience of young readers and beyond? Or is it in some ways, a drawback or an obstacle that it might have towards inviting social change?
That's a really great question. I'd be curious to know what you think as well, and what everyone else thinks. I think with any media, it circulates in a particular audience, depending on how it's sort of exhibited, distributed, right, framed. And so with young adult fiction, I like what Angie Thomas actually had said about why she wrote a young adult fiction novel. You know, she said it can be a mirror for younger people's experiences, but a window for adults. So you could see younger people could more easily see themselves reflected in it. And I think that that is one advantage of it being a young adult novel, that race is a problematic for youth, and goes to the title, right? The hate you give, little infants, F's everyone. And I mean, they brought in little infants, right, to mean not just youth, as Star says, but to mean the oppressed, as Maverick says. But really that, you know, race is very much structuring of young people's experiences. And when young people are given hate, you know, it grows like a seed, right? And like Tupac says, can explode later. So, and disadvantage people. So I think, yeah, that thing about mirroring, right, in a window, like maybe adults reading this wouldn't relate to all of the pop culture references, you know, within this, but it's very much about, you know, an intertextual, meaning like it references lots of different sort of media that young people might use, like Tumblr, right? And saying that it's not, you know, it's not trivial. It's very much part of young people's lives and the way that they interface with people.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, did that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I like that idea of it being a mirror for young people, but a window for adults. That helps me, I think, also understand my experience in reading the novel. So yeah, thank you.
One of the things I was hoping we could do would just be to reflect on what the title meant for us. Because right throughout the entire book, the title, "The Hate You Give," is so central to the story, and I'm curious what reflections we all had on the title as we read the book, and what we thought about it maybe at the beginning versus the end, or what thoughts we had about it. I'd also be curious if Paul and Angie want to add in here. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask that, but
you are, and I'm gonna push it to Paul.
Okay.
So you want me to give the first overture to this?
Yep.
You know, I think the title, I think the way it's positioned as a young adult piece of fiction, I think the title is crucial because of its close connection to hip hop and rap music. And I think, as someone brought up before, this ethos of kind of 90s nostalgia a little bit. And I think it's this through line throughout the whole book that helps kind of describe not just the way Star's making sense of her relationship with, say, her classmates at her private school that she commutes to, but her friends who she's left behind in the neighborhood who she doesn't see as often. It helps her kind of make sense of the demonstrations that she sees in her neighborhood as a result of Khalil's death. I think it helps frame for her how her father and how the adults in her world see the community, see their place in it. And I think I think it provides, in a really savvy way, this overarching framing that, as a reminder to the reader, that kind of, as you've said before, Kate, that like people do things in a very situated, community kind of localized way because of the social context that they're in, right? So it's this really sneaky way to use kind of a pop culture reference to remind people of that very deep, somewhat academic way of understanding people's motivations, their psychology, kind of all of the rest of that. And I also just think, kind of personally, Tupac Shakur is a very interesting icon in American culture. he's a very complex character, and the way some folks call him a prophet because of the way he wrote music, the way he performed music. I think that's also very resonant, and it provides an entry point for other folks to come into the book as well.
Yeah, for me, I think that what I carried with me through the book is the spelling of the book. So THU, the letter U and G, so thug. And for me, it was thinking about how Khalil had to be constructed as a thug to justify his death, his murder, and how Black bodies, no matter what, you always have to find that piece of the Black experience to justify something happening to us. So he was a thug, he sold drugs, he was in a gang, so maybe he deserved it. Maybe his murder was justified, and always having, to put those dehumanizing labels on Black bodies to justify the consumption of our pain, but also our murder. And so I think for me, that's what kind of followed me through the book. And even, thinking about Star, like if some of the students at her friends at her school, they wouldn't really label her a thug if she wasn't constantly like code switching and, dating this white guy, and, they knew her from her uncle's neighborhood, not her own. So like she had to constantly kind of, code switch and reevaluate how she showed up so she wouldn't be labeled as a thug, and why that label was so important that, she pushed away from. So for me, it was really about the thug, that piece of it to label Black bodies.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can add it to, I love what you guys just had to say about the title. I don't know if I have anything very meaningful I can add to it. I think it shows how rich it is, right? As the piece that Angie was just talking about, that thug piece, labels like that, stories like that become part of the hate given to little infants, right? So within the whole idea, that structural idea that, that the whole phrase is giving across, that thug label, that word plays such a key and violent part. And I was also interested by the 90s nostalgia, specifically, again, because of it being a YA novel. And I don't feel I know enough about 90s hip hop culture or hip hop culture in general to be able to speculate on it effectively. But for, again, the target audience of young adult readers, what's their relationship to figures like Tupac Shakur and to that era? It would have to be nostalgia for them, since for young adult, they wouldn't be even born in that decade if they're going to fall into the young adult category for our incoming students, right? All y'all were born after that decade. I would be really curious to hear, I guess our students are really the only ones that could answer this for us. And I'm really going to be interested to ask my students this semester of their relationship to that particular culture and how it resonates with them. I mean, I think that's what's great about this book, is it just means this is an incomplete discussion in the sense that we don't have our students here. That's the part of the discussion I'm really interested to hear when the semester gets rolling.
Mike, I think you mentioned earlier on something about how the book allowed everyone to kind of engage in it. And so even though there might have been, cultural references from like 90s hip hop culture, but also for young adults now, you were still able to kind of enter into the text. Yeah. I think Maverick, said early on in the book, he called someone a buster. And I was like, oh my God, like that, like, first of all, do people know what a buster is? And at first I felt really uncomfortable because it was almost like allowing white folks to kind of peek into a part of the culture that they might not know with this just one word. And so I was like, oh, I'm uncomfortable because are they going to get it? And then I was like, oh, I'm uncomfortable because I don't think they should. And so how have you all, as kind of outsiders of Black culture, how were you all still able to connect with the themes of the book? And were there points when you were reading it that made you uncomfortable kind of in your whiteness, kind of entering into this Black text?
I guess the thing for me here with your question, right, is that I think it's good for white people to feel uncomfortable entering into a text, right? Like, I need to be feeling uncomfortable regularly reading text and feeling like I need to look things up, or right, I need to look up the happy birthday song, right? Like, this is living in a society founded on white supremacy, right? I should feel uncomfortable when I'm reading things, and I should embrace it, and I should recognize that for people of color, right, that this is what reading so many texts throughout their education feels like. And I think that I need to be having that experience, and I should embrace it, and I should reflect on it and be thinking about it every time that I assign material to my students, or recommend that they read something.
So,
Yes.
oh,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No,
No.
go ahead.
No, I love what Kate just said there. I think that part of the discomfort is really what you know, a genuine, honest white engagement should be with a text like this. And it's part of, you know, education too, right? It's a big part of engaging in texts that challenge us, that we, you know, that we recognize our discomfort, that we enter that discomfort, that we really deal with it. But you know, there were, it's even with the moments that can be very specific. I think sometimes it's because they're specific, they also help us to relate more to. And you know, I'm just thinking of scenes, several of the scenes that were great in that they, mostly of Star's life with her family, that weren't actually necessarily pushing the narrative forward, but were just moments where we stopped and enjoyed some of the moments of just everyday pleasure that they got to have together as a family. So, I mean, I'm thinking of the scene where, isn't there a scene where they all are getting ready to watch a basketball game? I think maybe they've just gotten ice cream. I might be mashing two scenes together. But there's all this, you know, very rich, specific detail about, you know, Star's little ritual about what she does, where she sits when she watches the game, the posture she's in, what Maverick does, what her mother does, what her siblings do, and, you know, the rivalry they have in terms of the teams they root for, all of which was stuff I couldn't directly relate to from my own family experience. And I don't have much of a sports or basketball background either, so I can't even relate to watching sports events like that. But just that sense of the whole family being in the living room and having their own patterns and ways of living, that was so specific that yes, I could enter into that, because I could enter into imagining that scene, and all that particular detail was great, even though it's not detail that I could recognize from my own life. But even as I do that, part of my discomfort, and this is going to maybe what Kate's talking about, part of my discomfort always is now, when I enter into that scene, I'm like, okay, yeah, I recognize this, is worried that I'm entering into some false sense of universality or some false sense of sharedness, right? Like, now we're just relating to each other as people, we might say, right? Or this is just what's human about the scene, or this is just something that all human families share. And that's true, but you also worry then that you're losing sight of the ways in which it's really different, and you're losing sight of some of those unjust power structures, as Kate just said, about white supremacy, that you're losing sight of those when you get this idea of we're all kind of sharing in human things. So there's always a tension there and a discomfort, I think, for myself personally, when I read about scenes like that.
I think for me, part of the discomfort of reading goes to what you had just said, Angie, about sort of particular like Black vernacular terms that then become made mainstream, and how it's really important, you know, in communication to think about how Black culture, in particular African-American vernacular English, is often becomes mainstreamed, and then how it presumes, like Mike's saying, this false intimacy with Black culture and Black people themselves, and almost again is like a white innocence. So there were times when Chris was like was using sort of like terms that, you know, presumed a sort of intimacy, I think, with Black culture. And like Star said, like she can use the term ghetto, you know, like other people can't in describing her own experiences. So I think the discomfort for me comes in terms of yeah, how you're slipping into at times a false sort of language that isn't yours.
So as we close, there's a selection process on how we came to choose this book. And if you're really interested, you can go to the website, the Common Reader website, and read about how we did it. But there is a process, there's criteria. It is a community, there's community input on the book that we choose. But from you all's experiences with the text, from all the multiple lenses that we've talked about, why the hate you give at PLU at this time?
Well, one of the, as someone who's kind of been in this process with you all year, Angie, one of the things that I really like about this book at this time, beyond just the social context of what's happening and how it would give students an opportunity to start talking through how they understand what's happening right now, I think it provides multiple entry points for students to engage in the conversation in ways that maybe they haven't been able to before. And I think choosing a YA book also communicates to students that their knowledge and their experience and their expertise is important to us as an institution, and that we have as much to learn from them and their understanding of the world as they do from us and our understanding of the world. And I think it's a nice nod to just how relevant students' lives are for how they construct their understanding of what they're going to be learning and what they've already learned.
I mean, I can say as someone actually who was also part of the selection process, I was on the committee this year, so I was present for a lot of those discussions. And just to kind of back up what Paul was just saying, you know, I think at some point there was we had some concerns about the YA novel, and that we wanted to, you know, the common reading should be something that invites and is welcoming and appealing to first-year students, but we also want it to be challenging. Too, and you know, we worried, oh, if it's YA, is that not really challenging them? But I mean, of course, it's a very, not only is it a very good book, it's a challenging book, and of course the social context, which I should say, right? I mean, it was of course very relevant and timely when we chose it back in the spring, but of course it's become even more so over the course of the summer for obvious reasons. And I've been thinking a lot about how I want to teach this semester with everything that's going on, you know, COVID, of course, being the big frame that we're all living within right now, and how I want to, you know, do it with care and with care for my students, and not, though we are going to have to talk about tough things in my classes, also just not re-traumatizing people over and over again, or barraging them with all the stuff they're already barraged with on a daily basis in the media, by going to these topics all the time. But, you know, as we've been saying, that discomfort of having to confront uncomfortable truths and dig into them is part of education, and it's part of, I think, being a good citizen right now, to really deal with it. So I'm glad that we've I'm so glad we chose this book for many reasons. And one is we're not shying away from this conversation. We're going right to it, as worn down as we all might be by the stress of dealing with everything that's happening right now. We're not shying away from this conversation. I think this book is a wonderful way in, I think, for everyone to the conversation. So I'm really glad we assigned it.
I think for me, you know, I can only guess how, like, the reasons in the room for why it was assigned, but I'm glad it was, because for me, it really illuminates now that saying Black Lives Matter is a performance that is actually pretty easy for white people and corporations now. But what does that really mean? And what are the full implications of that being true, right? That Black Lives Matter and that all Black Lives Matter. And Star, you know, as a narrator, Angie Thomas ends the book with a promise, right? Not to forget. And so the work is really ongoing. And again, it's work. And we're having, I think that this book is good to read at PLU because, you know, students are part of that ongoing promise, you know, of living out and working on the full implications of Black Lives Mattering.
I have nothing to add, but I agree with all of you. I guess the only really minor thing to add is that just with how challenging we know this semester is already going to be and what all of our students are dealing with this summer, I think the young adult format of it being a YA novel really just helps to make it more accessible for our students and makes it an easier read. I think about past common reading that it was really, really dense, talking about really hard stuff, and I'd have to put it down and kind of take a break and like go back, right, and read the chapter over again and make sure that I was able to grasp the complexity of it. And this book touches on so many timely and important and complex things, but it's written about in a way that I feel like even though we're all overwhelmed by what's going on in our world right now, you can pick it up and you can read it and you can grasp all the meaning without maybe being intellectually exhausted in the way that maybe with past books we would have felt during these times.
So this is the end of our conversation, unfortunately, but it is not the end of the multiple conversations that you all and we will have the opportunity to engage with throughout the semester and probably throughout the entire academic year. So for the class of 2024, this is your book. This is your text. This is the book that you will carry with you through what year you graduate. So some of you might already have credits and might graduate in 22 or 24, 25, however long it takes you. This is the text that will be with you for your entire PLU career. And it is one of the best books that we've ever had for the Common Reading program. So be on the lookout for other opportunities to engage with faculty and students live via Zoom, but live to be able to have more conversations about the text. Bring it up in your Writing 101 class. Bring it up in other classes that you think there might not be a connection. An alum talked about how as a geologist, she can still engage in this text and bring that text to a geology classroom because there's history behind like rocks and fossils. Like they just didn't pop up. So these issues that are present in this book are not new. They just didn't develop overnight. And so from any academic discipline, any lens, you're able to engage with this book. And that's what I think makes it so special and so great. So shout out and thank you to Professor Rings, Professor Luther, Professor Ritchie, and hey, Paul, Professor Sutton, for having this conversation, really engaging with the text, and look forward to a great academic year. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.